All right, so what we're going to do is take a little bit of look at just mainly the lungs, and then, like I said, after that, we're going to start getting into the physiology of how we inhale and exhale and how the gases are exchanged. So, characteristics of the lungs, really, again, we talked about the bronchial tree and how everything goes down there. Again, lungs are kind of cone shaped, a little bit wider at the base, and they're going to narrow together at the top. Can again come right up underneath the clavicle on both sides. Again, underneath the ribs, you're going to have, it's lined in this here's cavity. This is the pleural cavity. But you have that costal surface, which is underneath the ribs, the mediastinal surface, which is along the upper part here, and then the diaphragmatic surface, which is going to be the part of the lungs that's just above the diaphragm. We're going to see there is an indentation on the left lung there, or the hilum. On the inside there, each of them have a little indentation. There is the cardiac notch, though, especially on the left side. And this is where the bronchi and all those different things are going to enter into the lungs and in the lymph and nerves and everything bypassing through that. Again, the right lung, larger, wider, more horizontal, more vertical primary bronchi on this one. We have two fissures in this one that are going to separate an upper, middle, and inferior lobe. Where on the left lung, because there's a heart there, we have that cardiac impression or notch on the surface on this side. There is just an upper lobe and a lower lobe that is kind of separating these into the two parts of that one. What we're going to see is with the lungs, they're partitioned into 10 different segments and a little bit less than that in the left lung. Each of these is going to be supplied by its own bronchus, its own segmental bronchus. Again, going to have good blood supply in terms of arteries and lymphatic vessels to go in these areas as well. Again, the way this is set up there is each little area is, because it is with one of these ones, if something was damaged in one of them, it doesn't inhibit the whole part of that, the whole rest of the lung from working. So by having these here, each one is kind of able to be removed individually if there was a disease in there based on what that segmental bronchus is supplying. And each one of these is then going to subdivide into a terminal bronchiole, and that's what's supplied to that, along with arteries and veins and lymphatic vessels going to each one of these segments. And you can see that in the picture right here. These are the different segments of this, each being, again, supplied by its own segmental bronchiole. And you can see how they kind of name all these. Not anything I'm worried that everybody knows on this one in terms of naming all of the different regions here. Again, when it comes to blood supply in the lungs, we really have we have the two branches of the circulation there. We have pulmonary circulation and really that circulation from the systemic stuff to the rest of this. Again, the pulmonary circulation is what is going to be supplying those alveoli. It's carrying the deoxygenated blood to those capillaries of the alveoli, going to reoxygenate the blood vessels, and then bring it back to those veins back to the heart. The bronchial circulation, this is part of that systemic circuit. These are arteries going off the aorta and other stuff like other branches from there. Again, taking oxygenated blood to these other structures of the respiratory tree or bronchial tree. And again, getting that blood and bringing it back to the heart so it can then go to the pulmonary vessels and exchange there. And this is again showing these different pathways of this, especially going to the pulmonary exchange regions here. Pulmonary circulation, like we said before, is the pulmonary circuit, much lower pressure system. It's only about 25/6 versus 120/80. The rest of this is a much higher pressure system, supplying the systemic circuit to the bronchial region and the trachea and everything else there. That is going to be closer to that 120/80, taking all the blood supply to those other regions where the exchange is not taking place. There is a plexus in terms of nerves there with parasympathetic and sympathetic control going to this, helping with bronchial constriction, bronchial dilation if need be. Again, also lymph vessels located around the lungs. Again, one of those places where it's easy to get foreign bodies in there. Pathogens is inhaling them, especially anything that is respiratory droplets or aerosol. So we have a lot of lymph vessels in this region, as well as lymph nodes screening those fluids. Again, very important that we get excess fluid from within the lungs and around the lungs, Anything that builds up fluid inside the lungs especially is going to increase that diffusion distance, which will have a tendency to decrease your ability to exchange gases. And again, this is a way we can get rid of some of that stuff that is not getting rid of by the cilia and the mucus trapping it before it gets down and a little bit deeper. We do have a lot of autonomic innervation traveling to these different parts here. Again, that vagus nerve is going to be supplying this, can influence the larynx as well as different parts of the bronchial tree. Again, mainly involved with bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction in terms of the vagus, bronchoconstriction in terms of the sympathetic nervous system. That's going to deal with our bronchodilation, and that's again coming from those lumbar, again, thoracolumbar, so it's coming from the thoracic exit there. Again, the lungs, the cavity that it's in is that pleural cavity, and if you remember, that is a serous membrane. So we have the visceral pleural that's lining the lungs, the parietal pleural that's lining the cavity, again made up by the different surfaces of the diaphragm, mediastinum, and the costal cartilage there. Each one is in its own little baggie, which again going to help prevent anything from being at one lung infecting another lung. So the fact that something's in one side doesn't mean it goes everywhere. That cavity is that space that's in between there. Generally, when the lungs are fully inflated, it is not necessarily there. They're almost touching. We actually want that fluid there, and we want some surface tension holding those things together. So when you expand your chest cavity, it actually expands the lungs as well. There is a little bit of fluid in there, like I said, a little bit going in there. If we always want that to be drained by the lymphatic system. We don't want it to build up in there. Anything that builds it up in there could collapse the lung. Air surrounding the lung can collapse the lung. That would be a pneumothorax. Blood or liquid. Blood is a hemothorax, can go in there and actually squeeze in on that. Anything that messes with the pressure surrounding the lung, we're going to see as we get into the next one here, really is going to mess with the ability of those lungs to stay inflated if we have pressure building up around the lungs. These differences in pressure are what are generally keeping the lungs inflated. If pressure builds up around that lung, it is going to actually not allow it to be inflated. And pleurisy is just this idea of these pleural membranes. It's super, super duper chest pain when this is happening. Hurts like crazy. Pleural effusion would be a buildup of fluid in this cavity. Again, can be due to pulmonary embolisms, issues with water balance, like this says there, cirrhosis of the liver, infections, inflammation can cause this as well. Again, anything that builds up to too much fluid in there is going to reduce your ability to take a deep breath in, which is part of the reason with that pleural effusion you're going to see there's going to be pain, but there's also going to be inability to take a deep breath, or you're going to have shortness of breath because you cannot expand those lungs as well, and because of that you don't generate as big a pressure difference and you can't take as much air in. So next time we'll start actually getting into the mechanics of how we inhale and everything else like that.